There are some things that happen in your life that you never forget, no matter how many years pass. This is one of those stories. It happened over 20 years ago during the summer I turned 13, and I've never told the complete truth about it until now. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway. We lived on a small farm at the edge of the Pacific Northwest wilderness. Our nearest neighbors were miles away, and behind our property stretched hundreds of acres of dense forest that seemed to go on forever. The trees were so thick in places that even at noon it looked like twilight underneath them. My parents had one strict rule about those woods: never go in alone. Of course, I'd been breaking that rule since I was old enough to walk steady. The forest was my playground. I knew every trail, every creek, every good climbing tree. I'd built forts, tracked deer, and spent countless hours just wandering through the green cathedral of towering firs and cedars. It felt more like home to me than the house sometimes. That particular summer started like any other. I helped with morning chores, fed the chickens, collected eggs, and then had the rest of the day to myself until dinner. The routine was comfortable and predictable. Wake up, work, explore, sleep, repeat. But everything changed the day the logging truck showed up. I first heard the diesel engines rumbling up the old logging road that ran along the back edge of our property. From the kitchen window, I could see dust clouds rising above the tree line. My dad went out to investigate and came back with a puzzled look on his face. The loggers weren't from any local company he recognized. No signs on their trucks, no familiar faces among the crew. They were polite enough when he talked to them, said they had permits to cut in a specific area deeper in the forest, but something about the whole operation felt off. My parents talked about it in hushed voices at dinner, but they didn't seem too concerned. Logging was common enough in our area. For the next few weeks, the sounds of chainsaws and heavy machinery echoed through the forest during daylight hours. What struck me as strange was the timing. Most logging operations started early in the morning and worked through the day, but these guys seemed to work in shifts around the clock. I'd hear machinery running well past dark, and sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the distant sound of diesel engines. The sounds were different too. Heavier machinery than a normal cutting operation would need. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like construction equipment, bulldozers and excavators, like they were doing more than just cutting trees. There were other sounds too, things I couldn't identify. Metal clanging, generators running constantly, and occasionally voices shouting orders over the noise. I was curious about what they were doing, but the work site was far enough from our property that I couldn't see much from the edge of our land. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of the workers through the trees when I was doing chores near the back fence, but they kept to themselves and didn't seem interested in socializing with locals. What really bothered me was how secretive the whole thing seemed. Most logging operations in our area were pretty open affairs. Companies would post signs, locals would know about them weeks in advance. Sometimes you'd even see the workers at the diner in town. But these guys appeared and disappeared like ghosts. No one in town seemed to know anything about them. During the third week of the operation, I noticed something else that didn't make sense. Game animals started showing up on our property that had never been there before. Deer were grazing in our pasture in broad daylight, something they normally wouldn't do. A family of raccoons took up residence in our barn, and I found bear scat near our chicken coop for the first time ever. It was like something had driven all the wildlife out of the deep forest, and they were looking for new territory. My parents grew more uneasy as the weeks went on. The sounds from the forest were keeping them awake at night, and my mom started complaining about headaches from the constant diesel fumes that drifted over our property when the wind was right. But they didn't talk about it much, and when I asked questions, they just said it wasn't our business what happened on other people's land. One evening in early July, we lost power for about 3 hours. The electric company said a tree had fallen on the line somewhere up in the logging area, But when the repair crew went to fix it, they came back with strange looks on their faces. My dad talked to one of the linemen at the hardware store the next day, and the guy mentioned seeing a lot more activity up there than a simple tree cutting operation would need. Heavy equipment that didn't make sense for logging, and security measures that seemed excessive for commercial forestry work. That's when my parents started talking in hushed voices again, and I could tell they were worried about something they weren't sharing with me. My dad started checking our property lines more frequently, and my mom insisted I stay closer to the house during the day. But they still wouldn't explain what was bothering them. By mid-July, my curiosity finally got the better of me. I decided I had to see what they were actually doing up there. I knew the forest well enough to get close without being seen, and if I was careful, I could observe from a safe distance and be back home before anyone noticed I was gone. I spent several days planning my route and watching the patterns of activity from as close as I dared get. The operation seemed to follow a schedule: heavy activity during the day, lighter crew at night, and a shift change around dinner time when there was less supervision. I also noticed that they had sentries posted, men who weren't doing any cutting but just standing around watching the forest. That told me they were worried about being observed. The day I chose for my reconnaissance was perfect for it, hot and humid with the kind of thick summer air that made even the trees seem sleepy. Cicadas buzzed in the undergrowth and the forest felt heavy and still. I waited until after lunch, when the chainsaws were running steady and would mask any noise I might make, then slipped into the woods through my usual route. I followed the sound of machinery deeper into the forest than I'd ever gone before. The familiar trails gave way to rough terrain, and I had to pick my way carefully through fallen logs and dense brush. The noise got louder as I climbed a steep ridge, and I could smell diesel exhaust and fresh-cut wood in the air. About a mile from the work site, I started finding signs that something unusual was happening. Fresh tracks in the mud that were too big to be human, broken branches at heights that no person could reach, and strange scratches on tree bark that looked like claw marks but were in patterns that didn't match any animal I knew. The tracks were the most disturbing. They looked almost human but were nearly twice the size of my own feet, with what appeared to be opposable thumbs on the hands. I also found areas where the undergrowth was flattened in circular patterns, like something large had been sleeping there. The vegetation was bent, not broken, suggesting whatever had made the impressions was trying not to damage the forest unnecessarily. Near one of these resting spots, I found tufts of coarse reddish-brown hair caught on thorns, unlike anything from local wildlife. As I got closer to the operation, I could hear voices more clearly, and what I overheard made my blood run cold. Men talking about tracking something, about setting up a perimeter, about using tranquilizer darts. This wasn't a logging operation at all. It was some kind of hunting expedition. When I finally reached a good vantage point on a ridge overlooking the work site, what I saw below made absolutely no sense at first. The clearing was massive, much bigger than any normal logging operation would need. There were more people than I'd expected, at least a dozen men scattered around the site. Some were working on cutting trees, but others seemed to be doing something completely different. Heavy equipment was arranged in a defensive pattern around the perimeter, like they were expecting trouble. There were generators running constantly, powering floodlights that would illuminate the entire area after dark. Men with rifles patrolled the edges of the clearing, and I could see communication equipment that looked military grade. But in the center of the clearing sat something that made my heart stop: an enormous metal cage. At first, I couldn't process what I was looking at. The cage was huge, easily 8 feet tall and just as wide, made of heavy steel bars that looked like they could hold a grizzly bear. But even from my hiding spot behind a fallen log, I could tell that whatever was inside wasn't a bear. The shape was wrong, too tall, even hunched over, too broad across the shoulders. And as I watched, frozen in disbelief, the thing inside the cage moved in a way that was almost human, but not quite. It gripped the bars with what looked like massive hands and shifted its weight from foot to foot like a person might. But everything about it was oversized and wrong. It was covered in dark reddish-brown fur that looked matted and dirty. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, and its arms hung nearly to its knees even when it was standing upright. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. When it turned toward my hiding spot, I caught a glimpse of features that looked almost human. Deep-set eyes, a broad, flat nose, a heavy brow ridge. But the proportions were all wrong, like someone had stretched a human face and made it too big. The creature looked injured. One shoulder was matted with what was definitely dried blood, and it moved stiffly, favoring its left side. It kept its head down most of the time, and there was something in its posture that spoke of exhaustion and defeat. It looked broken, not just physically, but spiritually. I watched for over an hour, trying to understand what I was seeing. The men around the clearing were clearly guarding it, at least 4 who weren't doing any tree cutting at all, just standing around with rifles and radio equipment. Near the cage was a large truck with a covered bed and heavy-duty winching equipment, like they were preparing to transport something extremely heavy. The whole setup looked professional, but hastily thrown together, like they'd had to work fast to contain something they hadn't expected to catch. What disturbed me most was how the creature reacted to its captors. When the men came near the cage, it would retreat to the far corner and make itself as small as possible. It never showed aggression, never tried to threaten them, just cowered like a beaten animal. But when they moved away, I could see it testing the bars, not trying to break them, but examining them with what looked like intelligence, like it was trying to figure out how the mechanism worked. During my observation, I witnessed something that convinced me this creature was far more than just an animal. One of the guards dropped his radio near the cage, and when he reached through the bars to retrieve it, the creature could have easily grabbed him. Instead, it carefully picked up the radio and handed it back to the man, making what sounded like a soft, hooting noise. The guard jerked his hand back like he'd been burned, but the creature just returned to its corner and sat down, watching him with what looked like sad curiosity. As the afternoon wore on, I noticed patterns in the creature's behavior that suggested high intelligence. It would track the guards' movements, seeming to memorize their routines. When feeding time came, it waited patiently while they slid food through a slot, then examined each item carefully before eating. It arranged the leftover scraps in neat piles, like it was saving them for later, or perhaps trying to maintain some sense of order in its confined world. The most heartbreaking moment came when storm clouds began gathering overhead. The creature looked up at the sky with such longing that it was almost human in its expression. It made soft sounds that might have been some form of communication, and I found myself wondering if it was calling to others of its kind, hoping for rescue that would never come. Finally, 2 of the men walked over to a spot near my hiding place to take a smoke break. They were close enough that I could hear their conversation clearly, and what they said made everything worse. "Boss wants this handled quiet," the first one said, lighting his cigarette with shaking hands. "No authorities, no questions. We get this thing moved tonight and collect our pay." The other man took a long drag and shook his head. "I still can't believe what we caught. 20 years I've been working these forests, tracking rumors and following leads. Never thought we'd actually find one. Well, now we have. Question is, can we get it out of here without anyone asking too many questions? What if someone already knows it's here? What if someone's been watching? Then we're all screwed. Operation shuts down, nobody gets paid, and probably worse than that." They talked about moving it after dark, taking back roads to avoid main highways and population centers. They mentioned someone called the Boss, who apparently had buyers lined up overseas, people who collected rare and exotic animals for private zoos or research facilities. They discussed tranquilizer protocols and transportation logistics like they were shipping livestock. Thing is, the first man continued, it's smart. Smarter than we expected. Keeps trying to communicate with us, making those sounds, almost like it's trying to tell us something. Yeah, well, smart or not, it's worth more money than I'll see in 10 lifetimes. Just hope it survives the trip. Boss says the buyers want it alive and healthy. Damaged goods don't bring premium prices. When they finally finished their cigarettes and walked back toward the cage, panic set in. I needed to get out of there before someone spotted me, but more than that, I needed to process what I'd learned. This wasn't just illegal hunting. This was capturing and trafficking an intelligent being, something that might be the last of its kind. I carefully backed away from my hiding spot and took a different route home, one that would keep me away from any of their sentries. The walk back felt like it took forever, and my mind was racing the entire time. What was that thing? How long had it been living in our forest? Was it the source of all the strange animal behavior we'd been seeing? The walk home gave me time to piece together what must have happened. The logging operation was a cover story. These men had been tracking the creature for weeks, maybe months, gradually destroying its habitat and driving it into smaller and smaller areas until they could corner it. The heavy equipment, the round-the-clock operation, the security measures, it all made sense now. I made it home just before dinner and somehow managed to act normal even though my hands were still shaking. When my parents asked about my day, I mumbled something about fishing in the creek and exploring some new trails. During dinner, I could barely eat. All I could think about were those eyes, the intelligence I'd seen in them, the pain and confusion, and something that looked like hope whenever the creature looked toward the forest. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature hunched in that cage, injured and alone, waiting for something terrible to happen. I kept thinking about what the men had said. They were going to move it tonight, take it somewhere far away where no one would ever see it again. And then what? What happened to something like that once it disappeared into the black market wildlife trade? I thought about telling my parents, but what could they do? Call the police? The operation would be gone before anyone could investigate, and these men had already demonstrated they were willing to use illegal methods to get what they wanted. Tell the newspapers? Who would believe such a story without proof? Around midnight, I made a decision that probably saved my life or ruined it, depending on how you look at it. I couldn't just lie there knowing what was happening. I had to go back. I knew it was stupid, dangerous beyond belief. Those men had guns, and they'd made it clear they couldn't afford to let anyone discover their operation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the only person who knew that creature was there, and if I didn't do something, no one would. I'd snuck out of the house before, so I knew which floorboards creaked and how to get past my parents' bedroom without waking them. I grabbed a flashlight, my pocket knife, and a small backpack with some basic supplies, rope, a wrench I'd found in the garage, and some food in case I got stranded in the forest. Then I slipped out the back door and into the darkness. The walk through the forest at night was terrifying. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow could have been a sentry. Owls hooted in the distance, and small animals rustled through the undergrowth, but somehow those normal forest sounds were more frightening than comforting. I used the moonlight to navigate when possible and only turned on the flashlight when absolutely necessary. It took twice as long as the afternoon trip, and by the time I reached the edge of the clearing, my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. The site looked different at night, more ominous but also more vulnerable. Most of the heavy equipment had been shut down, but there were still lights around the cage powered by a portable generator. I could see one guard sitting in a folding chair near the truck, his rifle leaning against a nearby tree. He looked tired, maybe even dozing. I watched from the shadows for 20 minutes, studying the layout and trying to work up the courage to move closer. The guard's head kept nodding forward, and his radio crackled occasionally with check-ins from other positions around the perimeter. Finally, his head stayed down, and I could hear soft snoring. He was asleep. This was my chance, and I knew it might be the only one I'd get. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept into the clearing, staying low and using the scattered equipment for cover. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would wake the guard, but he didn't stir. Step by step, I made my way toward the cage, freezing every time a twig snapped or the gravel crunched under my feet. The creature noticed me immediately. Its head came up and those intelligent eyes locked onto mine. I expected it to make noise, to alert the guard, but it stayed completely silent. It just watched me approach with what looked like curiosity mixed with resignation, like it had given up hope of rescue but was still interested in this strange development. When I got close enough to touch the cage, I could see the creature much more clearly. It was massive, easily 8.5 feet tall, even sitting down, with hands that could have crushed my skull without effort. But there was something gentle in its expression, something that reminded me of a sad dog waiting to be adopted from the animal shelter. I whispered as quietly as I could, "I want to help." The creature tilted its head, studying me with obvious intelligence. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, in a voice so low and gravelly it barely qualified as speech, it said one word: hurt. The shock of hearing it speak nearly knocked me over. My knees went weak, and I had to grab the cage bars to keep from falling. It could talk. This thing was intelligent, aware, capable of communication, and they had it locked up like an animal, planning to sell it to the highest bidder. It pointed at its injured shoulder with one massive hand, the gesture surprisingly gentle and precise. "Hurt," it repeated, then touched its chest. "Heart hurt." I found my voice enough to whisper back, "Can you walk? Can you get away if I free you?" Another pause, then a slow nod. "Walk. Run. Home." It gestured toward the dark forest with obvious longing. "Why did they catch you?" A longer silence this time. The creature looked around the clearing at the cut trees and scattered equipment, then back at me. "Home," it said, gesturing broadly at the forest around us. "Gone. No place." Its voice carried a sadness that was entirely human in its depth. That's when I fully understood. The logging operation wasn't just cutting trees. They had systematically destroyed this creature's territory, its home, everything it knew. They must have cornered it when it had nowhere left to run, captured it when it was weakened and desperate. And now they were going to profit from its suffering. I looked at the cage more carefully, trying to figure out how to get it open. The door was secured with a heavy padlock that I had no hope of breaking. But as I examined the hinges, I noticed something. The bolts holding them in place were old and rusted, and whoever had assembled the cage had done it quickly without paying attention to details. "I think I can get you out," I whispered, "but it might take a while. Can you stay quiet?" The creature nodded and moved to the back of the cage, making itself small and giving me room to work. It seemed to understand exactly what I was planning. Looking around the clearing, I spotted a toolbox near the generator. Moving as quietly as possible, I made my way over and found a wrench that looked like it might work. The guard was still asleep, but he shifted occasionally, and I knew my time was limited. Working on the first bolt was agony. It was rusted solid, and every turn of the wrench made a scraping sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest. I kept glancing at the guard, expecting him to wake up at any moment. The creature watched intently, occasionally looking toward the guard as well, and I got the impression it was ready to create a distraction if necessary. The first bolt finally came free after what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes. The second bolt fought me even harder. Halfway through loosening it, the wrench slipped and clanged against the metal door. The guard stirred, muttered something unintelligible, and shifted in his chair. Both the creature and I froze completely, not even breathing. After an eternity, the guard settled back into sleep. I waited another full minute before continuing with the second bolt. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wrench, but finally it came loose. The creature made a soft sound that might have been encouragement. The third and final bolt was easier, maybe because I was getting desperate, or maybe because the metal was softer. Either way, it came free much faster than the others. As soon as it was out, the door tilted forward under its own weight. The creature pushed it aside easily, demonstrating strength that was both awesome and terrifying. When it stood to its full height outside the cage, I realized just how massive it really was. It had to be close to 9 feet tall, with shoulders broader than any human's and arms that hung past its knees. For a moment, fear overwhelmed everything else. Had I just released something that could kill me without even trying? The creature seemed to sense my sudden terror. It immediately crouched down, making itself smaller and less threatening. Then it did something that changed my life forever. It leaned forward and placed one enormous hand gently on top of my head, barely touching, like it was blessing me. The gesture was so careful, so deliberate, that there was no mistaking its meaning. "Friend," it said in that same gravelly whisper, "thank you." But instead of immediately disappearing into the forest, the creature hesitated. It looked at me, then at the dark woods, then back at me. Finally, it gestured toward the trees and made a questioning sound. "You want me to come with you?" I whispered. It nodded and extended one massive hand, palm up, in an unmistakable invitation. I looked at the sleeping guard, at the clearing full of equipment and weapons, at the forest that had been my home for 13 years. Then I looked at this incredible being that had just offered me the greatest adventure of my life. I took its hand. The creature's grip was gentle but firm, and I was amazed by how warm its skin was despite the cool night air. It led me to the edge of the clearing, moving with surprising grace for something so large. At the forest line, it paused and looked back at the cage, at the evidence of its captivity. For a moment, I thought I saw something like anger cross its features, but then it turned away and focused on the journey ahead. Moving through the forest with the creature was like nothing I'd ever experienced. It knew every tree, every rock, every safe path through the undergrowth. We traveled in complete silence, communicating through gestures and touches. When I stumbled or got caught on a branch, it would steady me with infinite patience. When the terrain got too difficult, it would lift me over obstacles or help me find easier routes. We traveled for what felt like hours, going deeper into the forest than I'd ever been. The creature seemed to have a specific destination in mind, following paths that were invisible to me but clearly familiar to it. We crossed streams by walking on fallen logs, climbed ridgelines that offered spectacular views of the valley below, and passed through groves of ancient trees that felt sacred in their silence. As we walked, the creature began to relax. The tension left its shoulders, and its movements became more fluid and natural. Occasionally, it would stop to examine something, a particular tree, a rock formation, a small clearing, and I got the sense it was showing me things that were important to it, landmarks in its personal geography. Around 3 a.m, we reached what was obviously our destination, a hidden valley I never knew existed, tucked between two steep ridges and invisible from any direction unless you knew exactly where to look. The creature led me to a natural shelter formed by fallen logs and overhanging rock, a place that had obviously been used as a camp before. "Home," it said simply, settling down on a bed of soft pine needles. "Safe." I sat down beside it, still hardly believing where I was or what was happening. In the moonlight filtering through the trees, I could see the creature more clearly than ever before. Its fur was actually several different shades of brown and red, with silver tips that caught the light. Its face, while large and heavy-featured, had an intelligence and gentleness that was unmistakably person-like. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, just listening to the forest sounds around us. Finally, the creature began to speak in its low, careful voice. Its vocabulary was limited, but it could communicate basic concepts, and over the next few hours, I learned its story. It told me its people had lived in these forests for generations, keeping hidden from humans, but occasionally helping them when they found lost hikers or injured animals. They were few in number and grew fewer each year as their territory shrank. The logging operation had destroyed the heart of their traditional homeland, forcing the survivors to scatter to more remote areas. The creature, I started thinking of it as he, though I was never sure of gender, had been the youngest of his family group, left behind when the others fled because of his injured shoulder. He'd been alone for weeks, trying to survive on unfamiliar ground, when the hunters finally cornered him near a stream where he'd gone to drink. As dawn began to break, painting the sky pale pink through the canopy, he showed me things in the hidden valley that proved his intelligence and the sophistication of his people. There were carefully maintained clearings where edible plants grew in organized rows, stone tools arranged in neat caches, even what appeared to be crude pictographs on a rock face, showing figures that looked human but oversized. He gathered fruits and nuts from various locations around the valley, sharing them with me and showing me which plants were safe to eat and which should be avoided. He demonstrated how to find clean water by following certain animal paths, and how to build a fire without smoke that might betray our location. Most remarkably, he seemed to understand the concept of time. As the sun rose higher, he began making gestures that clearly meant I should leave, that people would be looking for me. But before I left, he did something that I'll never forget. He led me to a particular tree at the edge of the valley and carefully carved a symbol into the bark with one of his stone tools. It was simple but distinctive, like a hand with an extra thumb. Then he took my hand and pressed it against the carved symbol, looking at me intently. "Friend," he said, "always friend, you find again." He was giving me a way to locate him if I ever needed to, marking this place as somewhere I would always be welcome. The journey back to the edge of our property took most of the morning, but he knew shortcuts that cut the distance in half. We moved carefully, avoiding open areas and staying alert for signs of the hunting party that would surely be searching for him. As we got closer to familiar territory, I could hear vehicles in the distance and voices calling through the forest. At the boundary of our land, he stopped and crouched down to my level again. "Thank you," he said, placing both massive hands on my shoulders. "Free, home, family safe." "Will I see you again?" I asked. He pointed toward the hidden valley, then tapped the symbol he'd carved. "Friend always welcome, but careful, bad men still look." Then he melted into the forest so smoothly it was like watching smoke dissipate. One moment he was there, next I was alone on the familiar trail that led back to our house. I made it home just as my parents were starting breakfast, slipping in through the back door and trying to act normal despite having been awake all night. When they asked where I'd been so early, I said I'd gone fishing at the creek and lost track of time. My mom noticed I looked tired and suggested I take a nap after lunch. The rest of that day was chaos. By mid-morning, the forest was full of searchers. I could see helicopters circling overhead and hear dogs barking in the distance. Men in official-looking vehicles drove up and down the old logging road, and I even saw what looked like federal agents talking to my parents in our front yard. The story they told was that there had been an incident at the logging site. Equipment had been damaged, and a dangerous animal had escaped from a research facility. They warned all local residents to stay indoors and report any unusual sightings immediately. They made it sound like a bear or mountain lion, but I could tell from the scale of the search that they were looking for something much more significant. For 3 days, the search continued. On the 4th day, it suddenly stopped. All the vehicles disappeared, the helicopters stopped flying, and the forest went quiet again. When my dad asked one of the lingering officials what had happened, he was told the animal had been located and contained, and there was no longer any danger to the public. But I knew better. I knew my friend was still out there, safe in his hidden valley, probably watching the searchers stumble through the forest while remaining completely invisible to them. Over the following weeks, I found excuses to explore the forest in the direction of the hidden valley, but I was always careful not to go too far or stay too long. I found the tree with the carved symbol twice, but I never tried to make contact. The creature had trusted me with his location, and I wasn't going to abuse that trust by putting him at risk. The logging site was completely abandoned within a week. All the equipment disappeared, the temporary buildings were dismantled, and even most of the cut trees were hauled away. It was like they'd never been there except for the damage to the forest itself. Through small-town gossip, we learned that the operation had shut down abruptly with no explanation given to local authorities. Some people said there had been an accident, others claimed the company had run out of money, still others whispered about federal involvement and classified research projects. No one seemed to know the real reason, and after a while, people stopped talking about it altogether. About a year later, something wonderful happened. That section of forest was designated as protected wilderness. Development was prohibited, logging was banned, and the area became off-limits to commercial interest. The official reason was environmental protection and habitat preservation, but I always wondered if someone in authority had learned what the logging crew had really found there and decided the area needed special safeguards. For 2 years after that night, I found subtle signs that he was still there but never saw him directly. Occasionally, I'd discover arrangements of stones or sticks that looked too deliberate to be natural. Sometimes I'd find the remains of campfires in remote areas, cold ashes arranged in patterns that reminded me of the pictographs he'd shown me. I would hike past the tree with our carved symbol regularly, but I never tried to make contact. I figured if he wanted to see me, he'd find a way. Then, during the summer when I turned 15, something happened that I still think about almost daily. I was deeper in the forest than usual, following a deer trail that wound through some of the oldest growth in the protected area. It was late afternoon, and the light was filtering through the canopy in those golden shafts that make everything look magical. I'd been hiking for hours, just enjoying the solitude and the familiar comfort of being surrounded by trees. I was crossing a small meadow when I heard something that made me freeze. It was a soft hooting sound, low and musical, coming from the tree line about 50 yards ahead. I'd heard that sound before, that night in the hidden valley. My heart started racing as I scanned the shadows between the trees. At first, I saw nothing. The forest looked exactly as it always did, dense and green and still. But then my eyes caught a movement that was so subtle I almost missed it. A shadow that was slightly different from the other shadows, standing perfectly motionless behind a massive old-growth cedar. I stood completely still, hardly breathing, just watching. For what felt like minutes, nothing happened. Then the shadow moved, and I realized what I was looking at. He was standing there in the dappled light, partially concealed by the tree, but clearly visible once I knew where to look. Even from that distance, I could tell he had grown bigger in the 2 years since our encounter. He had to be close to 10 feet tall now, broader across the shoulders, more filled out. But there was something else different about him too. He looked healthier, more confident. The defeated posture I remembered from the cage was completely gone. For a long moment, we just looked at each other across that meadow. I wanted to call out, to run toward him, but something held me back. This wasn't like that night when he'd needed my help. This was his territory now, his choice whether to make contact. Then he did something that made my throat tight with emotion. He raised one massive arm and waved at me. Not a frantic wave or a gesture of warning, just a simple, slow wave like you'd give to an old friend you'd spotted across the street. The motion was so deliberately human, so clearly meant as a greeting, that there was no mistaking his intention. I waved back, probably grinning like an idiot. He stood there for another few seconds, and I swear I could see him watching me even at that distance. Then he turned and took one step back into the deeper shadows behind the cedar. And he was gone, not gradually disappearing like you'd expect from something moving away through the trees. Just gone, like he'd never been there at all. 1 second, he was a clearly visible figure standing behind that cedar. The next second, there was nothing but forest shadows and the gentle swaying of branches in the breeze. I ran across that meadow as fast as I could, desperate to see where he'd gone. When I reached the cedar, I searched frantically for any sign of his passage. The ground was soft with decades of fallen needles, perfect for holding tracks, but there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no disturbed vegetation. It was like he'd simply evaporated. I spent the next hour searching that entire area, looking for any trace of where he might have gone. The forest around the cedar was thick, but not impenetrable. There were clear paths a creature of his size would have to follow to move through it quietly. But every trail I checked showed no signs of recent passage. No bent grass, no scuff marks on rocks, no displaced moss on fallen logs. Finally, I had to accept that he was simply gone, vanished as completely as if he'd been a figment of my imagination. But I knew what I'd seen. That wave had been real. Deliberate, unmistakably meant for me. He'd wanted me to know he was there, wanted me to know he remembered our friendship. But he'd also made it clear that this brief acknowledgement was all the contact he was willing to have. The walk home that evening was strange. Part of me was thrilled to have seen him again, to know he was alive and well and still living in the protected forest. But another part of me was deeply unsettled by how completely he disappeared. I'd spent years hiking these woods, and I thought I understood how the forest worked, how things moved through it, what was possible and what wasn't. What I'd witnessed challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. How does something that massive, something that had to weigh at least 600 or 700 pounds, move through dense forest without leaving any trace? How does a creature nearly 10 feet tall simply vanish from sight in terrain that offers limited concealment? Over the years since then, I've developed a few theories, though none of them fully satisfy me. Maybe his people have an understanding of forest movement that goes far beyond anything humans have learned. Maybe they know how to step only on rocks and fallen logs, how to bend branches back into place behind them, how to read the terrain in ways that let them move like ghosts. Or maybe there's something about their anatomy that makes them naturally suited for stealth. Their feet were proportioned differently from human feet, longer and broader, with what look like more flexible toes. Perhaps they can distribute their weight in ways that don't leave obvious tracks. Their movements had always seemed more fluid than you'd expect from something so large, more like a big cat than a human. But even those explanations don't account for the sheer speed of his disappearance. I'd been watching him continuously, never taking my eyes off that spot behind the cedar. There simply hadn't been time for him to move far enough away to be invisible, no matter how stealthily he could travel. To this day, more than 20 years later, I still can't make sense of it. I've spent countless hours in that same area, studying the terrain, trying to figure out where he could have gone and how he could have gotten there so quickly. I've never found an answer that satisfies me. What I do know is that the encounter changed how I think about the forest. Before that day, I thought I understood the woods around my home pretty well. I knew where the deer trails led, where the good fishing spots were, which trees were safe to climb. I felt like I had a handle on the ecosystem and the creatures that lived in it. But seeing my friend vanish like that made me realize how much I didn't know, how much was happening in the forest that I was completely unaware of. If a 10-foot-tall creature could disappear without a trace right in front of my eyes, what else was out there that I'd never seen? How many times had I walked through the woods completely oblivious to what was watching me from the shadows? That brief encounter taught me humility in a way that nothing else could have. It reminded me that for all our technology and scientific understanding, there are still mysteries in this world that we can't explain, still things happening just beyond the edge of our perception. And once, about 5 years after that meadow encounter, I found fresh carving on trees near the hidden valley. More of those hand symbols, but smaller ones, like a family had been marking their territory. That discovery filled me with a happiness I can barely describe. It meant he hadn't just survived, but thrived. It meant there were others, that his people continued to live in the protected wilderness. Now, more than 20 years later, I still think about that night regularly. I remember the feeling of that massive hand on my head, gentle despite its obvious power. I remember the intelligence in those eyes, the sadness, and then something that might have been gratitude. Most of all, I remember those hours we spent together in the hidden valley, two very different beings sharing a moment of perfect understanding. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing. Was it dangerous to help something so powerful escape from people who might have had legitimate reasons for holding it? Could my actions have put other people at risk? But then I remember how defeated it looked in that cage, how carefully it touched my head, how it disappeared into the forest without hurting anyone. I think about what would have happened to it if those men had succeeded in their plan. And I know I made the right choice. The forest keeps its secrets, and this is one I'll carry for the rest of my life. Whether you believe the story or not doesn't really matter to me anymore. I know what I saw and I know what I did. Some encounters change you in ways that never fade, and this was mine. For one night, a 13-year-old boy and a creature that shouldn't exist became friends. And somewhere in the protected wilderness that used to be our forest, I like to think that friendship is still remembered. For more interesting stories, check this out.